girl should never take a taxi alone at night. You never know what might happen in a taxi late at night. A girl saw a woman dressed in white kneeling in an eerie posture by the roadside. Strangely, the driver claimed he didn't see anything, as the girl doubted her own eyes. The woman appeared right at the window, terrified. The girl had no idea that the most horrifying presence on this road wasn't the woman but the driver himself. As for why the woman got into that taxi, it all began with a dinner party. The movie opens with Anne, a pregnant bride-to-be. Recently, she's been having trouble with her fiancé, Patrick, who turns out to be a scumbag. Though engaged, Patrick has been having an affair with Anne's best friend and hoped he would settle down after their engagement. But during a wedding planning dinner, he brazenly groped her friend's thigh at the table, thinking Anne wouldn't notice. Feeling humiliated, and made an excuse to leave early. Realizing he had gone too far, Patrick hurried out after her to apologize, and refused to listen and flagged down a taxi. As the car turned the corner, she thought she saw a woman in the back seat, but when she looked again, the woman had vanished, dismissing it as a trick of her eyes, and got into the taxi. Before the driver could leave, Patrick and her friend caught up to them. Patrick grabbed Anne, begging for forgiveness, but she pushed him away and angrily got in the taxi. To her frustration, Patrick followed her inside. Their argument grew heated. Patrick tried apologizing, but Anne wasn't having it. In the midst of their bickering, the driver, who introduced himself as Ian, recognized Anne. He mentioned he had given her a ride earlier that day from the hospital. When Patrick learned Anne was pregnant, he finally understood her urgency to get married, but instead of stepping up, Patrick tried to convince Anne to terminate the pregnancy. Furious and heartbroken, Anne couldn't contain her anger anymore. Their shouting match distracted them from noticing that Ian had diverted from the route and was now driving down a desolate road. When Anne realized something was wrong, the car was already parked. She tried to get out, but the doors were locked. Patrick, still preoccupied with his argument, didn't notice until he too found the doors wouldn't budge. Before they could react, Ian tasered Patrick unconscious.
I'll do that.
And realized Ian wasn't just a random taxi driver. He had planned this. Lon took out a rope and tied Patrick in Anne's hands. When Anne offered him money in exchange for their freedom, Ian coldly replied that he wasn't interested in money, he was after her. He drove the taxi deep into the mountains. When Patrick regained consciousness, he tried to kick the driver's seat, but Ian veered the car wildly, warning him to stay quiet. When Patrick tried to bargain, offering him cash or anything he wanted, Ian dismissed him and started talking about his family, mentioning he had a young son. At first, Patrick thought Ian was upset because of the earlier argument about Anne's pregnancy. He promised to be a good father and take responsibility. Ian, however, remained indifferent. As they drove, and spotted a passing car and screamed for help, but the soundproof taxi prevented anyone from hearing her. Ian revealed that he had specially modified the car to ensure no one could hear or see what was happening, and Patrick realized Ian was no amateur. He had done this before. Ian pulled over, injected Patrick with a sedative, and forced him to drink water from a bottle, and tried to resist, but Ian poured it down her throat.
Drink it? Think of your kid. Get it down the fucking kid. Jesus.
Claiming she needed to use the bathroom, and begged to get out. Ian, however, handed her a portable urinal from the trunk, while Ian stepped away briefly, and secretly removed her underwear and tucked it under the car, hoping a passerby might find it and alert the police. But when Anne hid her trousers, a reflection suddenly appeared in the car window, and screamed. Ian, seemingly unfazed, pushed her back into the car and found the underwear under the vehicle. He warned her not to try anything like that again or she'd end up unconscious like Patrick. However, they had not been on the road for long before the woman from earlier reappeared and was startled by the terrifying scene and quickly turned her head away and was shocked. Did this mean Ian could see Hill too? Hearing Lan's words, and looked up in panic, she finally confirmed she hadn't been mistaken. She asked Lon, "Who is that woman?" Lon calmly began to explain the woman's background. It turned out this road was known as a haunted route in England. Around 10 years ago, a woman named the Hill and her daughter had driven along this road. For unknown reasons, they had a terrible accident. When the police arrived, they found Hill dead on the roadside in a gruesome state, and her daughter had mysteriously disappeared. There were no surveillance cameras back then, so no one knew what the mother and daughter had encountered in the mountains. But judging by Hill's horrific injuries, it seemed they had endured some inhuman torment. Since then, strange occurrences had plagued this road. Drivers passing by often reported seeing a woman in a white nightgown striking eerie poses by the roadside. At first, They assumed she was seeking help, but whenever they stopped to check, the woman would vanish into thin air. Because Hill never harmed anyone, most drivers didn't pay much attention to the stories, but that changed when one man encountered Hill on the road. After that encounter, he became cursed with endless bad luck and inexplicable paranormal experiences. Hearing Lan's story sent chills down Anne's spine. Just then, Hill appeared on a distant slope, waving her arms in bizarre, unnatural motions, and dared not look out the window and kept her eyes shut. She didn't know how long they drove before she finally opened them again, seeing Hill no longer outside, and let out a long sigh of relief. But as soon as she turned around, Hill suddenly appeared right by the roadside. Before Anne could react, Hill was inside the car. Terrified, and screamed, but Lon reassured her, telling her not to worry. Hill wasn't targeting Anne. Instead, she was after the child in Anne's womb. Anne was shocked, realizing that Lon could also see Hill. As Anne processed this, Lon finally revealed the reason he had kidnapped them. It turned out that Lon himself was the man who had encountered Hill on this road all those years ago. Back then, thinking the woman was in trouble, Lon had stopped his car to help her. But when he got out, Hill was nowhere to be seen. Confused, he turned back to his car, only to find Hill sitting in the back seat. Frightened, Lon stopped the car again, but Hill vanished just as mysteriously as she had appeared. After that day, Lan's home became a site of paranormal chaos. His son was possessed, often flying into violent rages. It wasn't until Lon consulted a priest that he learned he had been cursed by a malevolent spirit. Determined to understand what had happened, Lon investigated Hill's story and discovered the truth. Hill appeared on the roadside in search of her lost child. To save his son, Lon made a deal with Hill. If he could provide her with a substitute, she would spare his child. Disguising himself as a taxi driver, Lon began looking for a target at the hospital. That's when he noticed Anne, who had recently discovered she was pregnant. She was the perfect candidate. Lan's explanation left Anne horrified as she finally understood why she had been kidnapped. The car eventually arrived at an abandoned house, where both Anne and an unconscious Patrick were taken inside. Lon told Anne that she and Patrick would stay there until she gave birth. Lon then went outside to gather supplies. Seeing her chance, and tried to escape. She managed to wake Patrick, but the drug Lon had given him was too strong, leaving him weak and powerless. Patrick urged Anne to run for help and return with the authorities to rescue him. Reluctantly, Anne climbed out a window, stole a key from the table, and headed for the iron gate. But as she was about to unlock it, Lon emerged from the kitchen and saw her. Lon moved to stop Anne but was momentarily held back by Patrick, who weakly grabbed at him. Furious, Lon pulled a knife from his pocket and killed Patrick. Anne, now outside, had reached Lan's car. She started the engine, but Lon quickly chased her down. Realizing he might harm her, and clutched her belly. Lon hesitated, not wanting to hurt the unborn child, and threw Anne into the back seat, driving her to the mountains. At the roadside, Hill was already waiting. Lon intended to hand Anne over to Hill and end this nightmare, but just as Lon was about to act, Anne revealed a shocking truth.
There is no child here.
Because of her tumultuous relationship with Patrick, Anne had experienced a miscarriage. Lon, realizing he had been deceived, flew into a rage. Fearing exposure, he decided to kill and to silence her. As Lon opened the trunk to retrieve his tools, the surroundings turned eerily dark. Both Anne and the car vanished without a trace. Lon, confused, suddenly noticed a light ahead. Approaching it, he found his taxi but Anne was nowhere to be seen. He got back into the car, intending to leave. Halfway down the road, Lon received a call from his wife. As he reached for the phone, Anne suddenly darted out from the roadside. Lon slammed the brakes and jumped out to check, but there was no sign of anyone. Shaking his head, he dismissed it as a trick of the mind and drove on. But in the back seat, Anne had already reappeared. Clearly, their story was far from over. Yet, this is where the movie ends. This was the entirety of the 2024 British thriller Black Cab. That's all for today's recap. See you next time.